Good afternoon readers, it's Tilly here from Tilly Shelf. Today my intention is to talk to you about the sonnets from a very much the perspective of somebody who hasn't really studied them an awful lot. I'm going to talk a little bit more about that. And I'm going to focus on one sonnet, Sonnet 29, to talk a little bit about why I like that one in particular. I have no idea how this is going to go because I just had to do that introduction about 5 times and that's probably the easiest thing that I'm going to say. I have been on night shifts and I haven't slept very well in between my night shifts, so I've had about 10 hours sleep in the last 80 hours, which is just not a calculation that I should do because it just makes me unhappy. I wanted to film this today if I could, and I think I probably can. Let's see how it goes. Because it's now the 1st of October, so it's not ShakeTube anymore, and this is a ShakeTube video really. So before, in case I forget later on, I just wanted to say a really, really massive thank you to the hosts of ShakeTube this year, who were, oh god, I didn't learn my lesson from Victober. Steve Donahue, Jason from Old Blues Chapter and Verse, Lukash from Totally Pretentious, Kelly was the cheerleader from Books I'm Not Reading. I've really, really loved her kind of layman's videos that she's kind of done. Check them out. And then a sort of addition to the original setup was Mark from Wordswords Everywhere, who set the poems, and he said, you know, read all of them, but if you can't read all of them, here is one poem for every day of the month. That took me quite a few attempts to get that sentence out. Which is the option that I went for, and that's where I had my most success when it came to ShakeTube, because I read Titus Andronicus and Julius Caesar, I watched Henry IV Part 1 and 2, and then I was just overwhelmed by too much other stuff. And my only Shakespeare edition of the plays, apart from King Lear, which I have separately, is this, and it was just way too busy to carry around with me with all of the stuff that I was doing in September, so I just couldn't really read the plays. Whereas for the sonnets, I have this copy, which I got this in a second-hand bookshop. It was 50p, and I just thought this does actually have the sonnets in, but I don't know if you can see, that's not a very nice, comfortable way to read them. So I picked this one up so I would be able to read the sonnets, and now I have, so I have fulfilled the objective of buying this book. That's a good thing. So where was I? I was saying that I like the sonnets. I don't like the sonnets. I can't even work out what I think about the sonnets. I'm really not sure where to this is why I should plan. I did plan. I have notes for this video in a wide array of locations, and I'm gonna kind of like smush them all together and try to come out with a video on 10 hours of sleep. I've got a nice cup of chai here, and I'm gonna drink some chai, take some deep breaths, and then I'm gonna try and talk about Shakespeare. So as I was saying, or trying to say, I read the condensed versions of the poems as provided by Mark, and if you are interested in the sonnets and you haven't seen his videos yet, I cannot recommend his introduction video to the sonnets highly enough, and he made even like a Word document to accompany that, which is just fantastic and breaks down like the sonnet format for people who aren't familiar with it, and that was brilliant and really, really helpful, so thank you very much, Mark. Watch his video if you haven't. So one of the reasons that I thought I would do another ShakeTube related video was I posted a video about seeing King Lear last week, and there was just like a really nice cozy comment section full of really positive comments about people who also loved King Lear and kind of Shakespeare. So I feel like there's quite a few people who like Shakespeare out there who might appreciate another sort of Shakespeare related video, and I felt like I had some other things to sort of say on the ShakeTube Shakespeare topic area. So I'm going to start by talking to you about the poem that I liked, and like Mark did in his video on Sonnet 20, and like you might do in school, say if you were studying the sonnets, I'm going to try and take it apart a little bit and try to interpret and create my own interpretation, because this interpretation came to me as I was reading it and rereading it, because I tried to read each sonnet a couple of times to kind of get them into my head, and then I was looking at how I could back it up, and it just kind of came into being in that way. I'm filming in our spare room today instead of in front of the bookshelf because I can't be asked to stand up for an entire video, and I needed some like blank wall space that I can project the sonnet onto it. So all of this blank space is going to be filled with sonnet in a couple of minutes. Sonnet 29. When in disgrace with fortune and men's eyes, I all alone beweep my outcast state, and trouble death heaven with my bootless cries, and look upon myself and curse my fate, wishing me like to one more rich in hope, featured like him with friends possessed, desiring this man's art and that man's scope, with what I most enjoy contented least, yet in these thoughts myself almost despising, haply I think on thee, and then my state, like to the lark at break of day arising, from sullen earth sings hymns at heaven's gate. For thy sweet love remembered such wealth brings, that then I scorn to change my state with kings. So I've been reading quite a bit more poetry over the last month or so, and I'm planning to read some more in the coming months. And what I have realised is the things that I really appreciate in a poem are things like form and rhythm and structure. Like, I like a good old-fashioned traditional poem that, you know, it's a poem. Most of my favourite poems are either they are sonnets or they're very similarly very, very, very constrained to a form type. And obviously the sonnet is like one of the most constrained forms there is. You've got like the iambic pentameter, you've got the rhyming patterns, you've got even the themes of sonnets, they're like normally on certain themes. So yeah, I've realised that I like that, but at the same time I've also realised that I don't always like Shakespeare's version of that, which is funny because he is so often seen as like one of the best poets of our language. I mean, he is, in his plays, I love his plays and the poetry in his plays, but his poetry in his poetry, not so much. But it's nice that I'm kind of getting to know myself and getting to know what I like in poetry, because hopefully that's going to help me to find more poems that I enjoy, because I do struggle with poetry sometimes, and in particular I have struggled with these sonnets in terms of finding them quite incomprehensible at times. I feel like I really, really need a guiding light to kind of shine my way into a poem to start to be able to unpick it, because I feel like these poems are poems that you can't really enjoy without a little bit of unpicking. Obviously that all started to change in terms of like romanticism. Feeling started to dominate over form, so a lot of later poems, they tend to have less rigid structures and forms, and like modern poetry is very, very different to sonnets. I'm not saying that I don't like any modern poems, but for instance, one of the modern poems that I like the most is one called Waking with Russell, which is about a man waking up next to his baby son, and that is in a sonnet form and like very deliberately calls on like sonnet themes, and I love that. I guess I like to see the poet's skill presented in terms of how they can use that form to do something innovative and something moving. So, back to Sonnet 29. I realised that I liked this poem more than some of the other poems that Mark had offered us quite quickly. Almost like the first reading, I was like, oh wow, this poem makes sense and I like it. And I was thinking about it, and I was thinking in particular about that line, like to the lark at break of day arising, which is, I love that line. And then I realised that I have actually studied this poem before. So I didn't really think that I had studied any of Shakespeare's sonnets, but when I looked at that line and started to think about what made it such a nice line for me, and started to think, oh, why do I like the sounds there, what's good there, I remembered things, and I realised that I wasn't coming up with these clever ideas, I was actually remembering them. So I did an English literature block in college, which for me that was when I was 16 to 17 years old, and we actually studied the poems of John Donne. But my English teacher, who was an absolutely phenomenal English teacher, I think he was kind of a bit like, well, I don't want to study Donne without studying some Shakespeare first. So I'm a real hoarder. So these are all of my English notes from college. I kept them all for occasions like this, like it actually happened. So these are, I fished out my Shakespeare notes, and at that time my favourite of the ones that we did, which was only about like 4 of them, was Sonnet 116, and I wrote an essay about it entitled How Does Shakespeare Convey the Complexity of His Feeling in Sonnet 116, and it was the worst essay that I wrote in the entirety of my English literature course. So maybe that's why I don't like the sonnets, because I had my fingers burnt because I wrote this awful essay. I still like it, but I don't think it's as clever as I thought it was. Oh, English language, come to me. I view it differently now. So what was I saying? I was saying things. I had a point. There was a point to all of this. I'm running out of chai already. This isn't good. Ooh, I've just noticed a little note here. Do not project our judgments and ideas on the poet. That's what I'm about to do. So back then, when we talked about Sonnet 29, I think we talked about it for maybe half of a lesson, so that would have been for about half an hour. So it's not like we went into a lot of depth with it, but we definitely did talk about the line, like to the lark, because it stands out so much, and I will talk about why in a minute. And we talked about that poem with regards to things like maybe the sexual innuendo of singing hymns at heaven's gate. We talked about sort of Christian metaphors in terms of heaven's gate again as being the place of judgment. and we talked about sort of like the musical use of language and the line like to the lark. I feel like I'm losing the plot here. I really do. I do really like it, and I feel like it resonates for me. You know, it's inevitable that we bring our own experiences and our own mindset to our reading of the poem, and that might be why I didn't like the other ones, which I'll talk about later on if I get there. So what this poem means to me now is very different from what it meant to me then, which was not a lot. So my view of this poem now overall is that it is a poem about depression, and it is a very depressing poem about depression. I'm going to talk to you about all of the negative stuff that there is in this poem. So the poet sees himself as being in disgrace with fortune and men's eyes. He is all alone, beweeping his outcast state. He feels like his cries are not heard. He is troubling deaf heaven with his bootless cries, and he's cursing his fate. So that's the first 4 lines. That's the first quatrain. He's saying that he doesn't have any friends. He's not artistic, and he's not very broad. He is kind of discontented with his normal hobbies. He's really feeling like he's hating himself. And the only thing that makes him feel any better is remembering presumably his significant other. Oh, God, that's so sad. Things in this that make me think of depression. All alone, loneliness, that feeling of being an outcast and not being, you know, recognised and welcomed by the people around you, feeling like that you were in disgrace in men's eyes, without necessarily there being a reason why the poet doesn't provide a reason why he would be in disgrace. We don't get the evidence that there is a cause for that. What we get is the impression that it is a personal feeling because it goes with these other personal feelings. And self-hate, myself almost despising, lack of self-esteem, that void, that lack of happiness, and just not being able to enjoy and focus on the things that he loves, with what I most enjoy, contented least. All of that speaks to me of depression, and also saying, oh, you know, I don't have any friends, even though he's got someone that he loves, he feels like he has no friends. That kind of difficulty with the feeling of relating to other people at the time of being in a period of depression, that also seems to me to reflect that kind of emotional state. And then this comparison thing. So the first 4 lines is about him being really, really down, and the second 4 lines is about this ideal man that he compares him to, or multiple ideal men that he compares himself to. And he says, wishing me like to one more rich in hope. So it's not like somebody who is rich, it is rich in hope. And obviously the word rich there is it's tied to the idea of wealth that comes in at the end of the poem, and it does link to money, but he's talking about being rich in hope, so rich in positive emotions. So yeah, so he's talking about somebody who's rich in hope, rich in these positive emotions, who is handsome, featured like him, he says, has lots of friends possessed, and is artistic and broad, this man's art and that man's scope. That's who he wants to be and feels that he is not. So he's really created for himself, built up for himself this unattainable ideal of perfection, and I'm not somebody who is insanely knowledgeable about mental health, but I know that one of the things that can play into it is perfectionism and sort of the feeling of comparing yourself with others and finding yourself to be lacking, or perceiving oneself to be lacking when that happens. And I feel like that's really what he's doing here. Whether or not the poet or the protagonist of the poem does that deliberately, or whether it is just him, that's his experience, that's what he is feeling. That's how I see it. And the negativity in this poem, it really overflows. So the sonnet form, it's 14 lines long, it's broken into, like every introduction to the sonnets tells you this, and this isn't even an introduction to the sonnets, and I'm still going to tell you anyway, but the 14 lines of the sonnet, it's broken into the 8-line octet and the 6-line sestet, and the 8-line octet is in 2 sets of 4 lines, so we've got him being unhappy, we've got him comparing him to the perfect man, those are the 2 sets of 4 lines, and the sestet is like a counterbalance to the octet, and it kind of tends to look at the theme in a new light, or just progress it slightly and move it slightly, and that's how sonnets are normally arranged, and that's not really what we've got here. So if you listen to it, the negativity, it swells over into the sestet, so the positivity doesn't come in until later on than it should do. So here actually it's 10 lines of doom and gloom and 4 lines of potential happiness. So the Sestet begins, yet in these thoughts myself almost despising, so still negative. The word yet ostensibly begins to bring us into a new type of feeling, but it doesn't yet, because he's still saying that he's hating himself. Happily, I think on the and then my state, that's beginning to change. We're beginning to get some kind of benefit and some kind of Sestet type feel of resolution there. And then we get the start of the positivity really is the line, like to the lark at break of day arising. You could argue that there's numerous potential effects to this. Potentially, by condensing the positivity down into the end, it gives it more impact almost. It's the real turnaround at the end, and it kind of suddenly brings things back up. But to me, it doesn't do that. To me, it just, the happy bit of the end of the poem is dragged down by the excess of, I keep saying negativity, I can't think of another word because brain, by the excess of negativity in the start of the poem. And the overall effect is to make the piece very bleak and leave a lasting impression, I'm reading from my notes, of these overwhelming negative feelings that the poet is often experiencing. And I say often experiencing because that idea that it is happening often is cemented by the very first word of the poem and from the way that the poem is presented in the present tense. So when in disgrace, I look upon myself, you know, he's doing this not just one time, he's doing this repeatedly, and you know, he's not expecting this to stop, he's expecting it to happen again in the future. So that contributes to the idea of this being bleak, because we know that the poet has not found any real resolution to his feelings yet. He has to keep reminding himself of his lover while he is unhappy. He has to keep saying, oh, I've got this person and they love me and I love them, and that's a good thing. He has to keep doing that every time he is beweeping his outcast state. He has to keep trying to seek that emotion again. So let's talk about like to the lark at break of day arising. You all know about iambic pentameter, don't you? Da-dum, 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 da-dum. In line 11, what have we got? We have not got da-dum, 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 da-dum. We have got dum, da-da-dum, da-dum, 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 dum. So we've got 11 beats, and the stresses are just completely not where they should be. Like to the lark at break of day arising. So that change in stress immediately draws our attention to that line. We can't escape from the fact that this line is important because it is structured so that it breaks our pattern. When a poem has a very strict form and structure, when something happens to break that form and structure, we know it's not coincidence, and we know it is done to make us think and make us stop and make us dwell on that line, and that's what Shakespeare has done. He wants us to dwell on the image of the lark arising. And what a beautiful image that is. It's that idea of soaring up to heaven. That's literally what he says, at heaven's gate. And it's so happy. And when I first read this in this time round, I was like, oh wow, what a wonderful resolution to all of this bad stuff that's happening. Like to the lark, how lovely. No, not lovely. I've got some other notes here, but I'm going to help. If you go out onto the heath at break of day and you see a lark rise up and start to sing suspended in the sky, it looks everything that it is presented to be in this poem. Graceful, eloquent, and optimistic. But larks don't rise up out of coincidence, and they don't rise up out of something within themselves. Larks rise out of fear of what there is on the ground. In particular, direct threats. They perceive a threat and they fly up in alarm as a distraction and as a way of protecting what is most precious to them, which is their young. And that is what the lark is doing in this poem. It is an attempt to flee from and to distract from the problems on the ground, even as the poet knows that the core of himself, like the lark's chicks, remains down there and remains with the problems and cannot escape and cannot be rescued and lifted up to heaven's gate with him. You know, the lark goes up, but it has to come back down again. And that's what he's saying here. He's saying, look, I get up, I get to heaven's gate, I don't get into heaven. Like twice he talks about heaven as a place that he doesn't have access to. First it's death heaven and then it's heaven's gate. And inside heaven is this world where people have, sustainable positive emotions, and they are up there and they're not chained down to the ground with this negativity that the poet is dealing with. The poet talks about rising up to heaven's gate, not getting in, and the offshot of that is that he will have to come back down. So how else is that reflected in this line? Like I said, the rhythm is different here. Like to the lark, it is different, and the way that it is, and the vowel sounds as well, it's like the line takes off towards the end. It's like it does what the lark does. It sweeps up and ends up in the air. I mean, I wish I could eloquently talk about the sounds of the letters, because I think that's really important in this line. I'm going to do something that's going to sound really silly. I'm going to make the vowel sounds for you. I, R, A, I. It goes up. It does go up. I'm not making this up. I promise. Read it, and it sounds like it sounds like it goes up. And they're like big, open mouthy sounds. And that you've also got like the alliteration. The alliteration in this pair of lines helps to give it that uplifting feel. Like to the lark and hymns at heaven's gate. Brings the lines together, makes them more cohesive. And there's, I don't know if sibilance is maybe the right sound for it, but there's a lot of soft consonant-y sounds in line 11. So the two L's, they're soft sounds, and the soft D sound and a rising, like the zing. It's soft and it's beautiful and it's nice. But there's also the contrast to that, which is the K and the T sounds. So like to lark. They're very cutting. In the context of the line, they are cutting. They do create kind of like a ghost sound and a stutter that changes the way that kind of brings a little negativity even into the positive line. Like, he could have avoided that. For example, like, he chose the lark and he chose the way that the line was constructed. He could have said, seems as the swan. If he wanted to avoid the K sounds, he could have made a thing about swans swimming around. Like, that's the thing that he could have done. He had options. So even in this nice sounding, gorgeous line, you have that sort of negative sound butting in as well. I feel like I've made quite a half-hearted attempt at this, but overall, like, I hope you can see what I mean. Like, this is a depressing poem. That's my argument. This is a depressing poem about depression, and it is not a happy ending that it seems to be. So it would be nice if love could cure depression. And that's kind of the impression that we get on first reading of the poem, is that it's positive, it's uplifting, he remembers his love, and then he feels better and problem solved. But on closer reading, this falls down because of the things that I've said, like the word when, which implies that this happens frequently, and because of the image of the lark, where we know that the lark has to descend again. And he forgets about his love. For thy sweet love remembered such wealth brings. You would think, with a love so uplifting, it would be something that he would always be able to depend on, but it's something that his mind won't let him depend on. And we kind of tend to think, don't we, that love and romantic love, it's the kind of panacea, and once you have that romantic love, partly from what works like the works of Shakespeare, where they have the romances where everyone gets happily married at the end, we like to think that romantic love will solve all of our problems and will make us happy and will stop us from being lonely. And this poem says the opposite. It says he still feels alone and he still feels unhappy even though he's in love. I'm not saying that love is not good in depression. I think it does make a huge difference having somebody with whom you can always share things and share feelings like this, but definitely it's not a cure. And it's not a solution. And that's the conclusion of this poem, is that, you know, he can reason to the point of, I've got this wonderful person that I love, and that's a good thing, and I shouldn't be wanting to change my state with kings. And that's not an option for him. And he's stuck on sullen earth, thinking about his love. But I still like this poem, and I like it because it's very beautifully constructed. I really like the images that it talks about. I like the kind of the passion of his bootless cries. I feel like it's a relatable poem, and I do like the optimism at the end, even though now I see it as kind of mingled with negativity. I also see it as being, you know, this statement of, well, as long as I kind of remember my love and have that, at least I have one thing to draw on. Even, you know, he needs to work on his self-care, he needs to not be depending just on his lover, but, you know, they probably didn't have that as a concept back in Elizabethan days, so can't really have a go at him for that. So in essence, it wasn't very clearly spoken, but that was what I wanted to say about Sonnet 29. Sonnet 29 is a poem about the poet being intensely depressed and unhappy and wishing he could attain an ideal, perfect state and finding his only solace in his love, without that being a solace that will function for him in the long run. I just went to start editing and I realised that I have about 1 hour and 15 minutes of footage on this. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to divide the video into Sonnet 29 and then a second video on me ranting about the sonnets, effectively. So that's what I'm going to do. So this is me wrapping up from the first part of the video. Thank you very much for watching me talking about Sonnet 29, and let me know what you think about my interpretation. Tune in next time for when I talk about my dislike for some of the themes in the rest of the sonnets, and also slightly in this sonnet. And happy reading, bye!